Hello, everyone. My name is Dayan Martinez. Oh, wait, wrong. As of today, I'm Dayan Skipper Martinez because now I'm officially my married name. And I'm here to talk about Mabon, the whole of it, or as much of it as I know about. Um, First, though, I want to start with a bit of two, exactly two confessions. First of all, Maven is my return to the wheel, back to the beginning. It's my first holiday that I ever celebrated, which makes it one of my favorites, if not my absolute favorite of all the salads. But it is also one that I have known the least about for the longest time. And most of the time, I've just kind of shrugged and been like, oh, well, I guess I'll make something up in the meantime. But recently, my research interests in the ancient past, along with the ancient pagan past specifically, has sort of led me to uncover some things that are not just in my head, are somewhat research backed on their own, though, of course, there's always some speculation in stitching all these stories together. So mostly we're going to be learning what is known directly, what is analogous, and then also what story can be woven together by taking in the archaeological data, the historical data, and sort of doing a little bit of mythic weaving of it all together. All of this overall will feed into a version of the Mabon celebration that or the equinox celebration rather, that I have been using for a few years now here in Florida, developed by listening to the rhythms of the land here in Florida and adapting some of the mythic ideas that are prevalent in stories we'll cover today. So here is a general outline. I say some of the known European stories of the equinox because, of course, we don't know everything that our ancient ancestors believed and thought and worshipped with. We will, of course, feature mostly Greek and Celtic myth traditions because in some way they are more relevant to us, and also they're very well recorded and have a lot of compatibility between them. Though I won't go into all the detail, you can catch me later and we can speculate like crazy together. We're gonna have some inspired confabulation. I'm taking that from Hathaway about prehistory and what it could have meant, along with some of the celestial and astrological associations that may weave it all together. If not then certainly now. And of course, as always, I try to ground it all back into a local practice so that we can hit the ground running and working with it here rather than just knowing about it. So if you look very closely and you have studied these cultural groups in the past, you can basically tell where I'll be focusing most of my energy just based on these three pictures. We will talk about some of the more better known stories, starting with Persephone and Demeter. So there are two versions of the Persephone and Demeter story. And before we start, I want to say specifically, categorically, that there is no easy connection between the Eleusinian mysteries and the dates of the Eleusinian mysteries and some of what we will call Maiden specifically. But of course, there are echoes and there are ways to connect the two of them. The nice version of the abduction of Persephone gives her the agency that we require in the modern world. She chooses the underworld. She chooses Hades. And it is the meter who cannot let go, who cannot accept that her daughter is gone from the world where she has her power mostly. And so she deprives the land of fertility, she petitions Zeus, and eventually Persephone is brought back to her. In this version, which is a little more modern than some of us might think, Persephone eats of the apple or the pomegranate sometimes, and that equals out the amount of time that she must spend in the underworld, and therefore the time that Demeter mourns her daughter. I want you to keep an eye out for that theme, all right? Of course, as far as we know, what the ancients actually wrote and told to each other, Persephone is abducted by Hades. And it is gross because he's her uncle. And this is not kosher, and it wasn't kosher back then either. So we get the loss of fertility in the world, which for us feels like winter. And then Zeus is eventually forced to intercede on Persephone's behalf and request that Persephone come up. But again, she eats of the pomegranate, and her spirit is split. Her time is split between the underworld and the world of mortals. So, some of the elements that I want you to be paying close, direct attention to. There is an earth goddess, a mother goddess, definitely, because she is a mother, that brings winter to the earth at the loss of a child. This loss of fertility deprives the gods of sacrifices and worship, because if mortals are not eating for X amount of months, then the livestock is not fed, then the sacrifices of meat and grain and fermented grains is not being made either. A psychopomp, which is a guide to the underworld, god or goddess is sent to bring Persephone back. Sometimes that is Hecate, and sometimes it is Hermes, both of which have a lot of analogy between them. Consuming food from the underworld keeps you there, gets you stuck there. And then also, of course, the return of the missing child brings back the spring, which is the next equinox that we have in the wheel directly opposite to us, that being, of course, the spring equinox, otherwise known as Ostera. So, what else can we tell? What else can we glean from here? Let's take a short little trip to Wales. And to the story that gives us the name for the modern pagan holiday. So the character Mabon is fully named Mabon ap Modron, which is Welsh to say the son of the mother. They're really just titles, and you could take it as a poet's inspiration, an archetype in a way, even though archetypes are a modern construction. Or you could even say that these mythic beings, these mythic spirits, mean no other name. Like, for example, to say God. This is the son. This is the mother. You're meant to see yourself in their roles. So, very little is known of this story. Essentially, the child is lost or abducted at some point, and in the original story, he's never found again, ever again. It actually takes some retelling, some reworking, many, many years later for Modron to find her child Mabon. So, while the loss of the child here doesn't necessarily bring about a change of seasons, does not bring winter, many seasons do pass and change. And I'm sure for Modron, it feels like winter while her baby boy is missing. That reunion that I was speaking of gets told in the Arthurian cycle of all places, which is written sometime in or around the 12th century. And it takes one of Arthur's knights to reunite mother and child. And by this point, Mabon has grown up, become their own person, and they have been fostered by another family. There's, of course, much rejoicing in the reunion, and they ride off into the sunset, if you could imagine that, because then again, we lose the trail of them. So one thing that must be mentioned, of course, that the Arthurian cycle itself could be seen as a mirror, all right? Could be seen as a mirror of post-Christian, post-conversion British Isles, retelling some things that may have already existed, some stories that may have been remembered and stayed in the consciousness of the Celtic people. But of course, they can no longer be gods, so now we must make them knights. And they go on these heroic quests and they do all these things. And of course, there's a wizard. So when you hear of the Arthurian cycle, also think of Welsh figures like, for example, Bran the Blessed. Think of many other characters who in the more ancient past, not very ancient, but ancienter than Christianity, were part of a storied cycle going back and forth through the Isles. At least the story of Bran connects Wales to Ireland, for example. And there is no reason to doubt there was any amount of contact between those people in the Iron Age, as well, of course, as the Bronze Age that came before it. So elements to pay attention for, mythic elements to pay attention for. A lack of link between the child's appearance and the seasons. Mabon doesn't return until much later. And again, there's a grieving mother with the loss of a child. And of course, many different archetypal stand-ins are given in the case of Arthur's knights, Arthur himself, Modron, Mabon, and so on. So this is, in a way, what I always shrugged and say, well, this is what we know. And was kind of settled because, let's be honest, very little relationship that we can draw from the fruit harvest or the second harvest here in Florida, where it's harvest year round. And in fact, you get it in May and you get it in July and you get a little bit in other times of the year. So I was always a little bit lost. And here's what I found since. So in order to make that connection, we have to listen to what the scholars of myth are telling us, what the archaeology is telling us, and go to Neolithic and Bronze Age Ireland and make those connections there. So here we see in this picture some of the clues of what is coming up for you. Let's begin with the Irish connection. We are going to pursue the story here of Angus Oak, who is the young Angus, or the Angus that is ever young. He is the son of the Dauda, the chief of the gods for the Tuatha De Danann, and Boan, who is the goddess of the Boyne Valley as we know it today. And also, of course, the River Boyne, one of the biggest valleys and estuaries in Ireland that feed into the Irish Straits. The story goes that Boan and Dauda were not married. It was an illicit affair. In fact, she was married to Elkmar, who could be said to be also Nuada, who at one point was king of the Tuatha. And her one desire, her great and most overriding desire, was to consummate her love with Dauda, which was forbidden because she was a married woman. So together they tricked her husband to go do an errand, a quick little errand, just off to the country for just one day, except that Dauda, instead, here, let me engage the part where that's. Dauda bewitched the sun and the stars to stand still for Elkor, so that what to him felt like a single day was actually an entire year. And during that time, Boan became pregnant and carried the child to term, named him Angus Oak, which stands roughly for one desire. Oakma was never the wiser, and by all accounts raises the boy as his own, even allows him to inherit what eventually becomes the Brunabonia, which is the valley where New Grange is currently a part of, the whole monumental complex. One thing that I perhaps forgot to mention earlier, we can go back here, is who exactly Boan is beyond being a goddess of the land. There are quite a few stories told about her. Her name is related, is linked to as many things as a divine white cow, which reflects some of the stones that were used in the construction of New Grange, but also the Milky Way. Not just the river that flows through the valley, but also the heavenly river above, which passes through the earth because we are at an angle from the rest of the galaxy. So let's go on with the story of Angus. All right, we have Angus here who grows up. He is considered to be a great beauty among the Celts. He is likened with Belenus, a name which should sound familiar to all of us who also then celebrate Beltane, though there might be some differences between them, but there is a relationship there as well. And he is a god of youthfulness, of poetry, of beauty, as I already said, and also the essence of the lover's kiss. It is said that he is the space between the lips. So in effect, he kisses both of the lovers when they kiss. It is the expression of love. It is the feeling of love when you walk away from your sweetheart, that feeling of butterflies. That is Angus Oak. So he is also associated with the actual coming of the spring, as we can see later on. So it seems that after he grew up, he started having dreams of his true love, fair Maiden, who he only knew in his dreams, who would come to his bedside and sit next to him, and they would look and stare at each other longingly. But when he reached out to her, she would disappear. This made him lovesick, and of course his mom got worried. Everyone got worried. There was a general sorrow felt throughout the land because of this. And a great quest was undertaken to find this woman of beauty, woman of dreams throughout Ireland and Scotland. If you remember, that somewhat links to the Holy Grail, if you think about it in a sideways sort of way. So she was finally found after many years and many days. She was finally found in the shape of a swan, because that is who she was. She was a shapeshifter who lived most of the time in the shape of a swan. And he immediately recognized her, but she challenged him that her heart can only be won if he himself turned into a swan. They had to carry out the courtship in swan form. He did so because he is a child of great magic, after all, son of the Dauda. And they swooped around the sky many times in a circle and then went into the halls, into the depths of New Grange, and lived there together happily ever after. This is one of the great megalithic passage tombs that exist in the Boyne Valley. And as you saw in the picture from before, it's been lovingly reconstructed ever since. So, is there more? Turns out there is. Angus is also known in Scotland as the son of Beata, who is the fairy queen of winter in later tellings, but originally may have been known as the winter hag or the Cailleach. She was a great primordial goddess of the land. And in fact, there were many Cailleach, some of which had features of the land carved out all up and down Scotland, Ireland, and parts of England, especially the Northumbria, northern areas. But she was the queen of winter. And she didn't like anything becoming green or beautiful or turning into anything else, because then she would lose her grip on her beloved son and he would go away and live his own life. And it turned out there was this lovely maiden that came around. Her name was Bridget, another name that we should perhaps recognize. And so the Cailleach imprisoned Bridget, kept her in her castle as a maid, and forbade the two of them to ever be together. But eventually, much like in the story of Baba Yaga in the parts of Eastern Europe, Bridget and Angus do fall in love and hatch a plan to just escape the grips of this terrible, terrible mother figure who refuses to let go of her control. During this liberation, different accounts on how it happens, spring comes about and the land blossoms. It turns into greenery, the ground softens, and the life and woodlands of the Isles returns. This is perhaps one of the oldest retellings that we have of these particular three characters. Now, how accurate it may be, how embellished after the fact it may be, that is definitely up for some scholarship, right? And perhaps we just lack the sources to confirm exactly the age. But given the seasonal turns, given the agrarian feel that there is to this, it is entirely possible that it could date back to the Neolithic period some 6,000 or 5,000 years ago, which is also the time, coincidentally, where the megaliths were being built all up and down the British Isles. So we begin to see some connections, I hope. We're beginning to see the image of a mother who loves and adores her child and will do anything to bring him into the world, of a child that is lost to her in some way, perhaps to his own mind, to his desires, to growing up, the plain simple fact of growing up. A child who is all love and beauty and light and happiness, suddenly dimming because of the pains and aches of growing up, the finding of said maiden, the wooing of said maiden, and a seasonal cycle that seems to repeat. And in all this, we have, of course, the background of the megaliths of the ancient British Islanders. So, these traditions, of course, are in some part, at least, related to the autumnal equinox. And we might be able to date it and tie it together with the megaliths that were built, many of which had very specific solar alignments, even though it needs to be stressed, for the sake of honesty, that most of the alignments that we do notice with the remaining stones of the megaliths, whether at passage tombs, cairns, or standing stones, have to do with the sunrise of the winter solstice and the sunset of the summer solstice. Those, of course, would have been epically evident as the sun rose up in the northernmost point in the sky and set in the southernmost point in the sky. Those would have been very evident and easy to notice. So it is very easy to postulate such alignments. Those alignments, of course, take us to some of the other missing Sabbats that we have from our list. You know, those being midsummer and midwinter. Finding a strict connection to the equinoxes is a little tougher, because we are more aware that the equinoxes exist now because we have this solar system view of the Earth and the Sun. We have this connection that the Earth's axis can change according to its alignment with the Sun and can give us equal night and equal day. Truth be told, there is not even evidence that there were hours marked in the ancient past. So we cannot say whether the ancient peoples noticed that the amount of sunlight and darkness was anyway to roughly equal. Maybe they counted it in their own ways, and there is some speculation that perhaps they had a 16-hour day as opposed to a 24-hour day. But that is truly, truly, truly without any evidence whatsoever in the archaeological record. So the other thing that we have to, of course, connect with is the stars, the astrological aspect, the celestial aspect of this whole thing, because we have, of course, Boan's relationship with the Milky Way galaxy, a group of stars, along which we have many different constellations visible, including the Swan constellation. And if you remember the story of Angus Oak, there's a swan symbology there as well. And of course, we have the Greek gods and heroes always finding a way to be depicted among the stars as well. In fact, if you look at the northern hemisphere, at the star maps of the northern hemisphere, you will find many elements that align with the story. For example, a dragon. The maiden love of Angus Oak was found at the head of the Dragon Lake, roughly where Cygnus would be, near the head of Draco, the dragon. Nearby, of course, we have Taurus. We have more than a few great men in the stars, if you trace the constellations, who are almost possibly seen to be carrying clubs, like Daura. The Daura once carried great clubs to beat his enemies in the battlefield. And of course, there are other symbols that relate to that as well. And finally, we may not get strict correlation. That is the great frustration in all of this, that at least from what we have left to us and from what may translate to our time, it is difficult to go back 3, 4 more ages of cultural development and spiritual development and trace these connections easily. That is, of course, the difficulty that all reconstructionists, pagan reconstructionists, have when looking at the ancient past. You can ask the Norse, the Celtic reconstructionists. It is difficult to tie it all back to what we remember and what we know nowadays. Even our great 8-spoke wheel of the year is more of a mashup than you might think. The Celts, depending on where they lived, celebrated 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, any number of those holidays, and not necessarily in the same way or even in the same dates that we celebrate today. So what we have today is what makes sense to us, what has survived for us, what the ancestors have preserved in a way. So these stories that we can tell now, these stories that are left to us, it's just one way to get closer to understanding how the ancient people saw the great circle of the stars and the earth and of life here on earth, and how different people that we draw inspiration from, existing for many thousands of years at a time, could have seen the stars and the heavens. All right, so that's all well and good for ancient Britain and ancient Ireland. It's perfect. But what about us here in sunny South Florida? How exactly do we understand the passage of time when there's really only 2 seasons and every year they get a little more complicated. For example, one great way to track the seasons is by the migration of birds. I've spoken of this before in Moonpath CUUPs, but I am just realizing as of the last 2 days that the birds are here and they were meant to be here in mid-October. That's what the migration patterns that scientists have studied. The birds are here. I hear them every single day now. I see them around. And no doubt this is just but the vanguard of what's coming. So how does our sunny and beautiful land compare? We, of course, have our own seasonal cycles. And when we draw inspiration and we strip things down to the bare bones, we will see correlations, we will see connections, because everywhere the land changes, everywhere the land is our mother, and everywhere these cycles involve different entities, different powers, and different bonds that connect us from one sphere of life to another. Here in Florida, I have noticed that there is a dual process. There is this migration of birds that can punctuate the year very neatly in spring-ish and fall-ish. I'm interested to see how and when they come in this coming spring, because if they're here already, they're a month early. So what does that mean? For my inspiration, for what I have seen and gathered for myself in my own practice, I have seen that the birds come and they go. They come and they go. Sometimes they go south, and that is at this time, chasing the sun, chasing the warmth and the ripening fruit. And then in the spring, they come back up as we warm up with the sun, a solar cycle that repeats every single year. But when we can understand the birds as the messengers of the divine, as they were understood throughout all these different lands, then what happens in their absence? And who is here with us in our absence? And from that, we can take inspiration, of course, from our own ancient pagan myths. When the birds are migrating south to the lands of summer, then the ancestors will come in. And we are to open the ways for them, to welcome them in, until it culminates in our celebration of Samhain, where we feast with them. When the birds return, we bid the ancestors farewell. They too need rest. They too have their own business in the worlds and the lives beyond. So let's hope that we can see each other, gather virtually, and incorporate some of these stories and themes and ideas for our upcoming Mabon celebration, where we will make do without standing stones, and we will adapt what we have learned so far and this burgeoning understanding into our lives. Because at the end of the day, it is all about making our experience today richer by reaching backwards into time and into the future.